Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, episode 46. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Fellow at the America First Policy Institute and Chair of the China Policy Initiative. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful. Viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. We welcome you to check out our website and show archive at ChinaDeskPodcast.com, and you can always access our podcast at thefederalnewswire.com as well. My guest today is Harry Moser, founder of the Reshoring Initiative. He spent 25 years at the helm of what became GF Machining Solutions as North American president and subsequently chairman emeritus. Participated actively in President Obama's 2012 Insourcing Forum at the White House, and he testified at the June 9, 2022, Senate Commission hearing on U.S. supply chains and China. His awards include Industry Weeks and Association for Manufacturing Excellence's Hall of Fame. Harry, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in.
Hi, Steve. It's great to be here.
Well, thank you again so much for engaging the conversation. As we warned or otherwise alerted you to, we like at the beginning of every one of our programs for the audience to get to know a little bit about our guests, where they grew up, a couple of formative experiences. But my favorite is, when you were asked, say, at third grade, when you grow up, what were you going to do? Did you say, I'm going to establish the Reshoring Initiative?
Well, I grew up in Elizabeth, New Jersey, which is right across the river from New York. And the biggest thing in town was Singer sewing machine. Yeah. And my father ran about a third of the factory. Factory was 3,000 people, 5 million square feet. It was a huge factory, the biggest in the world. And so he was in manufacturing. So I knew I was going to be in manufacturing. So manufacturing has been in my blood that whole time. But the sad story is I drove past 20 years ago, and nothing of Singer is made there anymore. As far as I can tell, nothing is made anywhere in the country. Everything's imported from low-wage countries. So we offshored all that work, and my job is to bring that and everything else back.
So in very real sense, the Reshoring Initiative is kind of a coming home exercise for you.
Yeah. I was in a debate with a senior economics professor from Columbia, and he was from India. And so our different, as I described our different perspectives, he's seen India zoom up in terms of production, and I've seen the U.S. decline. So we have these very different experiences with globalization.
Yeah, perfect. Well, before we talk a little bit about the Reshoring Initiative, let's talk about kind of what your life experience was like. You had your upbringing watching your dad in action. You knew what you were destined to do by way of an industry, but talk a little bit about what some of your kind of key takeaways and accomplishments or observations were from your time actually working in manufacturing business.
On the way there, I got 2 degrees at MIT in engineering and an MBA at University of Chicago. So I understand the technical and the economic aspects of these things. And but throughout it, I saw this continuing, gradual decline in manufacturing and the need to do something about it. As I was selling capital equipment, machine tools, foundry equipment, real stuff kind of thing, and industry after industry, company after company that I wanted to sell to went out of business before I could sell anything. So major U.S. industries that were world leaders at one time disappeared, and that loss is why we're sort of the shadow of our former self, and so weak industrially relative to China.
Yeah. Well, we did have this whole wave of globalization, as I guess that's the catch-all word for it. I don't know whether it felt like globalization to a lot of America. It certainly had some enduring consequences. And you have mentioned India as another area where things have been offshored too. But in some ways, the giant sucking sound that Ross Perot talked about way back when he was talking about NAFTA was really talking more about south of our border. But the biggest move was to the People's Republic of China. You talk a little bit about, over the arc of your business career, kind of when that started to pick up pace, and did you ever imagine it would have this magnitude of a role in our manufacturing?
Well, certainly it accelerated with China joining the WTO and getting and still having most favored nation status with the United States, which is ludicrous. And but over that period, starting roughly 2000, I think, it just very rapidly grew, and they played the game very well. Mm-hmm. I mean, they decided what industries to go after. They decided what to train their people to do, train engineers, train tool makers, build infrastructure, build factories, such that at least for the last bunch of years, they buy like 3 times as many robots per year as we do, and 3 times as many CNC machine tools. And, all their factories now, if anything, are newer than ours. In some ways more productive than ours, so you put together that combination of high productivity and still wages that are about a third of ours, and they're very cost competitive. And even without the subsidies, but obviously the subsidies make it worse.
Well, the subsidies kind of cues into one of the areas that I'd like to drill down into. Of course, when there's sort of Adam Smith-like natural comparative advantages, if they have a lower standard of living and they have lower labor prices, that's going to have an impact. And in competition, in theory, there could be an equilibrium restored. But subsidies, and I would suspect some other areas, probably played an outsized role in China accelerating the aggregation of a lot of these supply chains, especially in manufacturing. So in your experience, so you mentioned customers that you would be going after, and all of a sudden they're not there. They've been kind of taken down a notch or out of the market in a certain sense. When you're talking to them, what were kind of the key factors about how they lost out to being what used to be a critical link in our supply chains here?
Price. Overwhelmingly price. As you can see in slide number 5, I've charted the China price, the ex-works price or FOB price, as a percentage of the U.S. price. And at the vertical horizontal line is 100%, so they're equal. To the left, China's cheaper. To the right, U.S. is cheaper. U.S. is almost never cheaper. And the mode of the distribution, the high point of the distribution, is somewhere around 65%. So the China price, on average, is about 65% of our price. And so you can see companies look at that and they say, well, if I don't do it, my competitors are all going to do it. They'll put me out of business. I have to do it, kind of thing. Right? Yeah. So they've managed through a combination of hard work, long-term planning, investment, relatively low wages, but rapidly rising wages, to be very, very price competitive.
And are there particular things that are what would fall into the category of market distortions as opposed to just working hard and planning better?
I read articles that talk about something like $300 billion in subsidies for their industries. And I haven't been able to figure out if that's annual or it's over a couple of years. The articles didn't seem specific to me on that case. But there's no question that they've done for 20 years what the Biden administration has started to do for the last 2 years. We sat here sort of dumb and happy and said, take it. And noted experts, economists would say, like Art Laffer, whom I respect, I've talked to him or read him saying, if someone else wants to make this stuff for you a lot cheaper than we can make it, we should take all we can get. And so, and my response then, and if all of our manufacturing disappears and we can't make anything for the military and we're entirely dependent on them, is that okay? Well, like this, right?
Yeah.
But that's been the attitude of the mainstream academic economists, that if they can do it cheaper, let them do it cheaper. We can all do think tank, or trade association or something. But it turns out that millions and millions of people that lost their jobs due to that offshoring have not found viable, acceptable alternative employment. The ability of the people to find good alternative work was intrinsic to the Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, but all the economists now that talk about it ignore that key principle of his thoughts.
Quite right on the classical economic theory. We can't really assume that we're in a post-history world where it doesn't really matter the nature of the regime that you're trading with or becoming increasingly dependent upon. There could be times when all of a sudden you find yourself dependent on someone who doesn't have your best interests at heart. And so all of a sudden not having that supply chain is more than just an economic issue. So
I want to add something to that. I read some work recently, and it's on slide number 8, and it's comments from Hal Brands, who's a distinguished professor at Johns Hopkins, and he said we should learn something from what's happening in the Ukraine, and what's happening so far in Taiwan, not much, but what's happening in the Ukraine, the Middle East, that the U.S. is not able to properly support our military because we can't make howitzer shells, we can't make bullets, we can't make tanks, we can't make anything fast enough to support the little bit of engagements that are going on right now around the world. And he said we should learn from that and see that we have a feeble industrial base and that we need to strengthen that. We need to strengthen not just the defense industry, but the overall U.S. manufacturing industry. Because if you don't do that, if you go back to World War II, we got in the war, and we were able to pull people from making cars and making whatever to making tanks. But if nobody's making cars, you got nobody trained to pull over. So for example, at Singer Sewing Machine during World War II, my father was making bomb sights for the Air Force. Okay? But if that factory hadn't been there, they wouldn't have had him, they wouldn't have had the equipment, they wouldn't have the skills to do the bomb sights. And China has this huge industrial complex that makes everything in the world, and they can shift people around. We don't have the skills, we don't have the equipment, and if things got really nasty and we needed to dramatically increase the production of things, we don't make enough of the machine tools and the equipment that makes the things to be able to expand rapidly. So we're in a tough place. So anyway, so as Hal Brand said, start making more now so that if things go really bad, you've got the capacity to adapt.
Well, it's certainly an important reminder. It's probably a good point in the conversation to do a little bit of an introduction on what the Reshoring Initiative is and what your mission is.
Okay, so the mission is to balance the goods trade deficit. So goods are things, appliances, clothing, what have you. And that trade deficit, the trade balance was neutral until the late 1970s, and then basically continued to increase until the last couple of years. And recently it's been about $1.1 trillion per year. So we import 1.1 trillion more than we export. It turns out we import more than we produce. Mm-hmm. So we're more than half dependent on imports for survival. That's not a long-term sustainable condition.
Yeah, and so when we look at this, we've talked a little bit about it already in the conversation, but can you put in perspective, since we are the China desk, what proportion or what's the scope of the role China plays in the overall need for this Reshoring Initiative?
First, let me go back and tell you a little more about the Reshoring Initiative. So that's our mission, and we document the trend. We're the only source of data on, for example, that if we go to slide number 1, you'll see that the number of jobs either reshored or FDI'd, foreign direct investment, foreign companies coming here, per year went from a total of about 11,000 in 2010 when we started, and last year was about 297,000. So it's up almost 30 times over that time period. So we document the trend, we promote it like we're promoting it today with your help. We enable it. So we have tools to help the companies make smarter decisions. So where think tanks would say, here's more or less what the government should do, okay, to some extent. Whereas we say, companies, it isn't perfect out there. It's an unlevel playing field. It's really a tough game. But here's what you can do to do better with the conditions that we have. So we document, we promote, we enable, and then to a small extent, we advocate with the government to level the playing field so that companies will decide to reshore without my having to work so hard to convince them to do so.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of talk in recent years about the idea of reshoring, but also safe shoring. So basically, we can easily point to problems that might be unique to China and say, okay, there's a real problem that if they are potentially going to cause a conflict, say over Taiwan or something else, that we can't really afford to be overly dependent on them for some things. And so whether it moves to Vietnam, India, the Western Hemisphere, Southeast Asia, something, there's this idea of safe shoring, if not reshoring. When you deal with this, you're primarily looking at bring it on home to the United States and make sure that we have these jobs and these capabilities here. Do I have that right?
Yeah, our first priority is reshoring, because by reshoring, first, you've got it. You don't know at what point Vietnam, say it all moved to Vietnam, and China said, it's all in Vietnam, we'll take Vietnam. Yeah. and then it's China again. So the closer the better. So our first choice is to get it here. But we're rather supportive of nearshoring, which could be Canada, but turns out to be Mexico, because the Mexicans have lots of labor, and their labor is cheaper than Chinese labor, and they're right across the border, and they're unlikely to start a war with us. I think, yeah. and so also because product or goods that come out of China have about 4% U.S. content, and product that comes out of Mexico has about 40% U.S. content. We provide maybe the steel and the plastic and the tools and the engineering maybe. And so when you get work from, say, China or India back to Mexico, you've got sort of a half a loaf, and half a loaf's better than no loaf. So we're supportive of it, but not to the extent, like I don't like it when U.S. companies announce they're moving work that's now here down to Mexico. I love it if they say they're moving work from there somewhere else to Mexico.
A good distinction, an important distinction to make. But what do you see as the biggest challenges to achieving this mission? I strongly suspect that magic word price is going to play a role again.
I showed you the chart, and it's not just China. Right. The U.S. is high-priced relative to almost every other country. I mean, certainly to India, certainly to Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, et cetera, largely wage-driven. Because finally, despite sort of myths to the contrary, labor, including the labor from digging the ore to making the steel, to making the pieces, to assembling the product, we put all the labor and all the kinds of labor together. Labor is finally 70, 80% of the cost of something. And therefore, when their label's a third of ours, that final cost is going to be a lot lower, especially if they have access to all the same technology and same machine tools, same productivity, same everything that we do. Right? So if you look at our competitiveness, the U.S. has trade deficits with 9 of our top 10 trading partners. The only one we don't have a trade deficit with is the U.K., which we're sort of following into industrial decline over the last decades, and that's not good. And so just sort of a general principle for I think I'd like the listeners to hear is that yes, we want to make sure the things we do don't strengthen China anymore, and preferably keep weaken it a little bit economically and therefore militarily, but we want to at the same time strengthen the U.S. because if you look economically or manufacturing wise, China's up here and we're sort of here. And if we pull them down a little, well, that's okay. But if we pull us up some at the same time, well, then we're more likely to get to an advantageous or at least a more competitive position. So we say that what's needed is to first skilled workforce. We need a skilled workforce like Germany, the apprenticeship systems, lots of engineers, all this kind of thing that we seriously lack. And for absolutely necessary. And then second, something that helps additionally on cost or price. And it finally comes down to two choices, we believe, either tariffs or currency. And since tariffs is, I think a value-added tax would be fine if you're going to do tariffs. But to me, the simplest thing is to do currency. And there's a methodology called the market access charge by Dr. John Hanson that shows a way to gradually reduce the value of the dollar. And if you do that, if the price difference is this right now, all of a sudden the price difference is that much, and then it's a lot easier to convince companies to bring the work back.
Well, we're certainly not adverse to talking about tariffs as well when it comes to the general effort to rebalance our economic relations, especially with competitors who might not be following all the rules or setting high standards as we see it. And if they aren't supporting the best interests of the American people, our communities, our families, and our workers, well, then whatever can be done to kind of put incentives in place to put these things in a safer, nearer, or as you would say, reshored back here is a step in the right direction. So how long has the Reshoring Initiative been underway, and how would you kind of assess the metrics of progress made so far, and what does that say about your highest near-term priorities going into the next year or so?
Okay. So I showed you the chart before with the growth and the number of jobs, much more than anybody, even I believed was possible. Helped a lot by President Biden and Bidenomics, and you throw hundreds of billions of dollars at something, you hopefully get something at least in the short term from it. So it's been very rewarding in that sense. But if we don't do something about the cost structure, then I'm afraid these extra factories they're building are going to wind up not being world competitive. And eventually they're going to disappear. They're going to go under. And so for example, with chips, every country in the world is building chip factories, and we've got a dozen of them, 10, 20 billion, $100 billion. And my fear is, since already most of our chips are exported, I'm concerned that when we double our capacity here, that unless we assemble more of the electronic products here, unless we assemble the electronic medical devices, the infotainment systems, the servers, et cetera, that we're going to be dependent on China to buy our chips to make those things for us. And they're going to say, hell no, we're using our own chips that we just developed. And so we say, get the overall manufacturing cost competitive so all that assembly work comes back, so there's a market for the chips after we've spent those tens of billions building the factories.
Yeah. Well, there's an area of cost that we haven't addressed so far, but I would wager to say is absolutely vital to that price calculation and vital to resiliency, and that's energy. If you're going to be a manufacturing economy, a competitive high-tech manufacturing economy, you have to have reliable baseload energy to do that. One area where China has moved really far ahead is in nuclear energy. The United States has had almost no new permitting on that area. The other area where China is very far ahead of us is processing. What are your thoughts about the role of energy strategy as a part of making America more competitive as a locus for manufacturing?
Yeah. So first, the one you didn't mention is natural gas per se,
Yeah.
and natural gas has played an important role in making some segments of U.S. relatively competitive. For example, the production of plastics, because the price of natural gas is lower here, much lower here than Europe, especially after the Ukraine invasion. And so a lot of German chemical companies are building chemical plants in the U.S. to take advantage of our low-cost natural gas instead of their high-cost, not available natural gas. So that's been good. I agree entirely on the electricity. I've been in favor of nuclear power for 50 years and gotten nowhere with it. But it looks like it's coming out. Bill Gates has that one factory going in. And China's building, I don't know, 1 a month or 5 a year or something like that. And we haven't built, we think we built one in 30 years.
It's awful. It's awful. I mean,
totally insane.
Obviously, they're not going to build them with the same standards, recyclability, or whatever else that would be the case if it was done here in America or in an allied country. I mean, basically, we've got France that is a nuclear power, and a lot of the rest of us have been talking about jobs in manufacturing, but then also climate, but not talking about the most effective energy production where you're not dependent in a time of crisis that also isn't carbon emitting. And we've gotten actually better about guarding against accidents and more efficient on the recycling. But to me, that's a major area where the U.S. could be much more competitive. And you would think it would make the Reshoring Initiative an even easier sell.
Yeah, actually, what ties in with that is ESG, and some people love it, some hate it. But we've done studies on 9 different products: aluminum die casting, steel, wood, plastic, etc. And it turns out that the Chinese electricity generation, despite all their nuclear, they have. We have maybe 10% of ours or 15% coal generated, and they have 50% or 60% coal.
Huge.
So their amount of emissions per kilowatt hour is 50% higher than ours is. So by bringing work back here to the U.S., you save a huge amount of emissions on the production of the product, and then some on the shipping of the product, and then some on the disposal of the product because you buy too much from there because it's so cheap. And so by thinking about ESG, prioritizing ESG, I think instead of companies and some conservative groups sort of avoiding ESG, I think they should embrace it. And then when products coming in from countries that have high emissions, tax them, apply the carbon tax to the product that they're bringing in. So in our methodology, we have. We're coming out with a revised version of our TCO estimator that will quantify for any given product that the company is thinking about reshoring or offshoring. It'll tell them what that value of the carbon is that they're going to either increase by offshoring or reduce by bringing it here. And it turns out a survey done about a year ago showed that when they asked companies, what is the biggest reason, the biggest methodology you're using to enable your environmental, getting your emissions down, and reshoring was the number one answer by the company. So the companies are embracing reshoring as a means of cleaning up the environment.
Yeah, well, I'm not a huge fan. In fact, I'm not a fan of using ESG and other things like that. But I am a fan of having clean water and clean air and being a good steward of what we have. And you just can't do it if you're going to be relying on an economy where there aren't standards for those things that are verifiable. And the China industrial model, even according to China's best experts internally, would say this has been pretty rough on the natural endowment that China's had for land and water and other resources. Obviously, if those are things that are real high motivators for you, all the more reason you should be reshoring to a responsible location to be doing your manufacturing. I mean, you can't really get a pass on the environmental grade if you're going to rely on the world's biggest polluter to be your base of manufacturing.
So right now, the ESG is very complicated, the way they read them and do it. And I've tried to convince the raters to simplify it. What is the product? So is it electricity intense? where is it made, where is it sold? And if you answer China, it's electricity intense and it's sold in the United States, you get a big negative.
Yes. Well,
so let me show you about one way we help people. So slide number 7 shows our TCO estimator and the impact of it. So the blue line there is the same data I showed you before on the China price, percentage of the U.S. price. Horizontal axis is still China, percentage of U.S. And the red line is total cost of ownership, which is price plus duty, freight, packaging, carrying cost of inventory, everything else you can think of like that. And the yellow line is the TCO, but with a 15% Section 301 tariff thrown in. So, which actually 25 would be more typical. And the key thing to look at is the numbers in the lower left corner. So with price, the U.S. wins 8% of the time, with total cost 32%. And if there happens to be a tariff, then 46%. So this tool, the TCO estimator, is free online for companies to use to either make smarter, to buy smarter, to consider these factors when they're deciding to get it there or get it here, or to sell smarter. So for smaller companies to use to convince their bigger company buyers that are so proud of their environmental efforts that the best thing they could do environmentally is to bring the work back and give it to the smaller U.S. company.
Excellent. Well, I think we've alluded to this a little bit along the conversation, but I think it's pretty intuitive to an American audience why reshoring makes good sense. And I think we know a little bit about what China's value proposition is for why companies would feel induced to look in that direction. But are there any things that China is specifically doing that kind of counter the narrative or counter the mission of your reshoring initiative? I mean, how are they pushing the headwinds against this common sense direction of your initiative?
Now, I'd say two things. First, they've been pushing this shock two, or some people call it, excess capacity, producing 50, 75% more than they choose to consume, because their people save 30, 40% of their income. We save 2% or something, And so they've decided to vastly increase their manufacturing output and therefore dump the product into the world market. You see that with the EVs. You see it with steel, all kinds of products coming out of China. And so that's obviously a headwind, because if the price is even lower from China than it was, I think they've allowed their currency to weaken moderately, which further helps. Subsidies here, there, wherever. So that's certainly been a problem. But they, I think that's probably the most important thing that they've done. Yeah.
On those things, I mean, some of these are topics that have been around for ages. I remember being a very young analyst in the early 90s, and the Commerce Department was very much focused on what was happening on anti-dumping, what was happening in sort of trade distorting activities in non-market economies. In that time, China was considered to be a non-market economy. So when we look at something like dumping, why haven't we had more effective policies to guard against this kind of a thing? I mean, this has been sneaking up on us for longer than the WTO has existed.
I think because unless you get really aggressive, like was done with automobiles, with the Japanese, maybe with appliances, unless you get really aggressive like that, what Trump might do with his, 60% or whatever, unless you get really aggressive, I think the dumping activity employs more lawyers than manufacturers because it's so narrow, and pages of arguments and stuff, and most of them probably don't go through, and so finally it's a waste of time. So what instead should happen, as I pointed out before, is if if our costs are 10 and everywhere else at 7, you got to get that down so we're 8 in their 7, or we're 9 in their 8, or something like that. And again, the best way to do that is either have really efficient, skilled workforce like the Germans and the Swiss, or I'd say either tariffs or currency. And if you don't do that, then the differences will still be so much that I think even without subsidies, because in terms of subsidies, we're subsidizing now with the chips and the cars, so, and you can't subsidize everything. Somebody came to me and he makes steel tanks of some kind. I'm thinking, I don't know, 4 feet long, 2 feet in diameter, something like that. Steel, rounded on the end. And he wanted me to help him reshore them, and we looked into it, and and he can buy them completed in China, duty and freight here, for less than the price of buying the steel here.
Yeah.
And if he bought the steel here, he'd have to machine it, he'd have to weld it, he'd have to do everything else to put it together. And so by allowing ourselves to have the steel price here, whatever, 20%, 30% higher than 40% higher than over there, anybody who's sort of seriously using steel and is competing with product coming in, especially from China, but also from other sort of steel intense producing countries, is at a too big a disadvantage. And so whereas if the dollar say was 20% lower, 30% lower, it would look a lot more attractive to people.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've mentioned a couple of different times the skilled workforce part of this too, and I think that's a really meaningful part of the conversation. China, of course, has a very different social, political, and education system. America's education system and workforce development policies of recent decades have been a little bit, I would just categorize as sloppy. But maybe I'm being unfair in that regard. But what would be your kind of top tier options for how do we not necessarily go from 0 to 100 in the next year, but how do we start bending this curve back in a serious way when it comes to skilled workforce? Is it the apprenticeships and scholarships to go to tech colleges and universities? Is it trying to do things to steer more people into the hard sciences and maybe spend a little less time on TikTok? What would be the things to do to really bend that curve back to America's advantage for our own sake?
Yeah. I think the government, society, and the government has to look at the problem. Most economists would agree that economic growth is a function of population size and productivity. And it's a function of the population, those who are working, and are they working productively? And so we've encouraged a system. The government has enabled a system in which college for everyone is the default solution. If the high school can possibly get them into any college anywhere, well, that's good rating for the high school. They push them in, and like I go crazy with a chart that's on the Department of Labor, Department of Education websites, and it's headlined $1 million more lifetime income versus high school. And it starts off with no high school, community college, bachelor's, master's, PhD, income going up. Okay, so clearly degrees is a way to win. And I've met in the Secretary of Labor's conference room and talked to them and chastised them and said, you should have in here, right in the middle, next to the bachelor's degree, the income of people who've passed an apprenticeship, as you mentioned. And as the Germans and the Swiss and the Austrians and so on do so well. And it turns out that income here is equivalent to the income for people with bachelor's degrees. And they put some notes and footnotes. I got a little in there, but they didn't change the chart. And if I were in charge, they'd change it the first day I was president. And because what they're really acting as shills for the university system, because they think that if we all went to university, the country would be richer. But it turns out that at any point in time, 30 or 40% of the people who have bachelor's degrees between the ages of, say, 25 and 65 are in jobs that do not require a university degree. They're working at Starbucks or Chipotle or somewhere like that. And at a time,
or they're inventing and manufacturing things.
Yeah. But at a time when we need tool makers and welders and precision machinists and engineers, and we have hundreds of billions, I guess, of student loans being defaulted by people whom we approved to go in and study liberal arts, who would never make enough income to pay off the debt at a time when we don't have enough engineers and don't have enough tool makers. So we advocate for apprenticeship loans so that it'll be more affordable for company and apprentice to have apprentices. And then we'll adjust that balance. Now, it can't happen in 1 year, but over 10 years, we could make a huge difference. Because if you have to do it, because my objective is to increase U.S. manufacturing by 40%. To do that, you need 20 or 30% more workers at a time when we're losing people because of retirements. So we need to add millions. And if we don't, so you need to get those millions more workers, both to get the quantity of the output, but also to get the quality and the productivity that we need to be competitive.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a hugely important topic area. I don't think it gets talked about enough in the context of U.S.-China competition, or however anyone wants to frame it. And you don't have to think ill of the other side. I might sometimes for my own reasons, but really for our own self-interest, good self-interest, we should be doing a bit more. I'll just share with you as we wind down to our close. One of the ideas that I tried to push for in my ill-fated time in politics is I said, look, I speak a foreign language. Mandarin Chinese happens to be the one that I speak. And I believe it is a good thing for people to learn to think in another language and be exposed to other cultures. However, it's always been taken as just generally accepted that someone going and getting a liberal arts degree will have a foreign language requirement. And I don't think anyone in a long time has ever second guessed, well, why do we have that? What if instead of, or maybe as a significant alternative by choice, we had a tech skills requirement so that if, as you're going through college and incurring this debt, what if you got a plumbing apprenticeship? What if you got a welding apprenticeship? What if you got some other kind of skill, whether it's coding or whatever else the tech college is offering, and you got a simple 6-month, 12-month, even better 2-year certificate in that? Number one, you probably can be employed while you're going to school and you'll encourage less debt. Number two, when it turns out you need to move from liberal arts job to liberal arts job, you can at least make a living doing something when you relocate until you're lucky enough to land your next liberal arts related job. And by the way, there's value in that work. And the skills can be needed in a time of crisis. You can help family members. I grew up in a huge family. My father was fourth of 15 kids. And so somebody had to be a plumber, somebody had to be an electrician. There was a bunch of mechanics. That's because as a family, you had to survive. And so we had this distribution of skills. We've just gotten away from that in our value structure and our economic structure. And I think if we're going to compete with China and reshore, as your initiative advocates, we're going to have some of this creative thinking come back. But I hope that some of those ideas that you've been advocating resonate in the conversation, in thoughts about dealing with the challenge that China presents, but also just how to reinvigorate America generally. But
I've got a couple more things I'd like to throw in.
Jump in.
So one, especially since we're talking about China, a survey was done by Chief Executive Magazine about a year ago. And they asked companies, what's the biggest driving force in reshoring? And geopolitical risk was the biggest driver. So companies are worried. So they're reshoring as a form of insurance to make sure that they have the components so they can continue to ship the product. And so we then came out with a chart, so slide number 4, which shows the probability of decoupling of the U.S. from each of the major countries of the world. And it's expressed as the probability of decoupling happening in a given year. And so the idea is for companies to say, if I can't get those components from China, how much of my end product will I not be able to ship for how long, when I and 10,000 other companies are trying to find somebody to make stuff for them because the war happened this day, okay? And so what's my expected value loss on profitability? So how much more as insurance should I be willing to pay for the components now to make sure I have the supply chain here? So I think that's a real tool that people listening to this can apply in what they do. And then just a last sort of summary point on my part, I follow Ray Dalio, who has his changing world order theory. And in slide 10, he shows what's happened as a series of empires have risen and fallen. So we had Holland and then UK taking over from Holland. And then we had the US around the world wars taking over from the UK. And now we got China coming up to compete with the US. And the US sort of in decline up here for, I'd say, significantly because of offshoring and not enough reshoring. And so if you look at the determinants by which Dalio says what determines whether the U.S. continues on here at the top or whether it falls off and whether China comes up here, that by doing reshoring, by getting ready to reshore, we increase productivity, we improve education, we improve trade, we reduce the debt, we do all kinds of important things that will allow us to stay longer at the top and give China, which has its own problems of debt and demographics and drought and all kinds of, and its kids don't want to work in a factory anymore. So give China a chance to sort of peak out and calm down like this, and then find hopefully the possibility for coexistence of the two instead of, the worst thing would be war. Right? Yeah. None of us wants a war. But I'm afraid that the U.S., if we're not strong enough to maintain our military, strong enough to pay our debt, to afford the budget and so on, that you might be forced into some horrible action by either side that none of us wants. So a nice, stable, solid, strong U.S. extending into the future, which I think reshoring is key to make happen.
Well, before we close out the program, Harry, where would you like to point people to go to follow the initiative or otherwise follow your work?
So you can reach me at harry.moser@reshorenow.org. You can find our website at reshorenow.org. You can we're very active on LinkedIn. So you look up Harry Moser on LinkedIn, you'll find it. And we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter. We've got sort of the whole kit there. And but most is if you're in government, we have information and ideas and concepts. We have the competitiveness toolkit that tells you if you do these things, how much you'll increase manufacturing and how to go about doing it. So anybody in government that would like that kind of help, we're here to help. Anybody in companies that want help reshoring, send me an email, give me a call, and delighted to help you.
Well, wonderful. Now, to our audience, I'll ask you if you've enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing and visit ChinaDeskPodcast.com. Thank you very much for joining, and a special thank you to Harry Moser for sharing his perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.